All right, let's dive right in. We're going to trace the absolutely incredible journey of the early United States. I mean, how did a brand new, kind of vulnerable nation start throwing its weight around with such, well, ambition on the world stage?
So that really brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did a country that was, let's be honest, still finding its footing go from being pretty weak to basically drawing a line in the sand for the huge European empires? Well, that's the story we're going to unpack. And this really shows you the whole transformation in a nutshell. I mean, look at the starting point. Paying tribute to pirates, literally relying on the British Navy for protection. And the destination? Projecting its own force and warning those same European empires to back off. It's a massive shift. So the question is, how did they pull it off? Okay, so our story really kicks off with the one thing that drove pretty much all of early American foreign policy: money. Or to be more specific, trade.
You have to understand, for the young United States, trade wasn't just important, it was its lifeblood. It was, well, everything. But the high seas were a really dangerous place. You had these established European naval powers everywhere, and American ships were, frankly, easy targets. This forced the new nation to figure out what it meant to be a sovereign country, not just on its own soil, but out on the open ocean.
And that brings us to a really defining moment: the Barbary Wars. So for years, the U.S. did what a lot of other countries did. They just paid off these North African states, the so-called Barbary pirates, so they wouldn't attack their ships. But then President Thomas Jefferson comes along and basically says, nope, not anymore. Enough is enough. And in a move that was pretty shocking at the time, he refused to pay and sent the brand new U.S. Navy all the way to the Mediterranean to deal with them head on.
Now, you've got to understand what a huge deal this was. This was America's first ever overseas military mission. By taking on the Barbary states, the U.S. was basically planting a flag and telling the world, hey, we will defend our own interests with our own navy. Thank you very much. For a young republic that most of Europe just kind of dismissed, this was a massive step.
Okay, so dealing with the Barbary pirates was one thing, but trying to navigate the constant wars between Britain and France, that was a whole other level of difficulty. So the U.S. tries this, let's call it a gamble. It was called Macon's Bill Number 2. The idea was clever, try to play the two European giants off each other to protect American trade. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, saw an opportunity, played the U.S., and the whole plan just completely backfired. It ended up pushing the U.S. even closer to war with Britain. And eventually, those tensions just boiled over. That's how we get the War of 1812, which some people call America's Second War of Independence. So what was it all about? Well, a few big things. The biggest one, making up almost half the reason, was the British practice of impressment. They were literally kidnapping American sailors off U.S. ships and forcing them into the Royal Navy. On top of that, you had all the trade restrictions and the fact that the British were supporting Native American resistance out on the frontier. So here's the thing about the War of 1812. On paper, nobody really gained much territory, but the psychological victory for the United States was absolutely immense. That final, decisive win at the Battle of New Orleans, which, fun fact, was actually fought after the peace treaty had been signed, they just didn't know it yet, it created this huge wave of nationalism and pride. It really helped forge a stronger sense of what it meant to be American, and proved to themselves and the world that the U.S. could go toe-to-toe with a global superpower.
All right, so after proving it could hold its own on the high seas, the United States turned its attention inward. It was time to focus on consolidating its own territory and basically drawing the national map.
So, after the war, the border with British Canada was still, well, a bit of a mess. It was pretty vague in a lot of places. But this is where some really smart diplomacy comes in, led by the very, very capable John Quincy Adams. They managed to reach some key agreements. The Great Lakes, demilitarized. The northern border, set right at the 49th parallel. And for that tricky, disputed Oregon Territory, they came up with a pretty clever compromise for joint occupation, all done peacefully. The southern border, though, that was a completely different story. It was a real flashpoint. Super unstable, with constant raids coming out of Spanish-held Florida into U.S. territory. So, President Monroe had a clear mission: secure that border. Period. And who do you send to handle a tough job like that? Well, you send the hero of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson. But his orders were crystal clear, super explicit: secure the border, but and this is a big but, do not engage Spanish forces under any circumstances.
Well, Andrew Jackson wasn't exactly known for following orders to the letter. He marches right into Florida, completely exceeds his mandate, and attacks 2 Spanish forts. Just like that, he creates a massive international incident.
Now, Jackson's actions were totally unauthorized and super controversial. But here's the key takeaway. They sent a very powerful message. Spain was already weak, dealing with rebellions all over its empire, and they basically saw the writing on the wall. They realized they couldn't actually defend Florida anymore, so they figured it was better to sell it than to just lose it. And that's exactly what happened. The whole thing was made official with the Adams-Onis Treaty. And this was a huge deal. It didn't just give the U.S. Florida, it also drew a clear border with Spanish territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This treaty really cemented America's claim to be a true continental nation. Okay, so with all these successes under its belt, the United States is feeling pretty confident, bold even, and it's ready to make its most audacious move yet. Basically, declaring the entire Western Hemisphere its own sphere of influence. And the timing for this couldn't have been better. Why? Because all across Latin America, there was this huge wave of independence movements. New nations were breaking free from Spain and Portugal. The U.S. moved really quickly to officially recognize these new countries, which was a way of signaling its support and, directly challenging that old European colonial system. And all of this leads to the big one, the landmark Monroe Doctrine in 1823. What was it? In essence, it was a giant hands-off sign pointed directly at Europe. The U.S. declared that the Americas, both North and South, were officially closed for business when it came to future colonization or meddling by European powers. It really boiled down to 3 core ideas, nice and simple. Number 1, no new European colonies in the Americas. Got it? Good. Number 2, Europe needed to stop interfering with the newly independent nations. And number 3, the U.S. promised in return to stay out of European affairs. It was America, loud and clear, claiming the role of protector for the whole hemisphere. But, and this is a really important but, was this just talk? I mean, it's a super bold declaration, right? The truth is, at that moment, the United States military, especially its Navy, was nowhere near strong enough to actually enforce this. If a major European power had called their bluff, could the U.S. have stopped them? Probably not. Aha! And this is where we find this secret ingredient, the little plot twist. The Monroe Doctrine worked at first, not because of American strength, but because of the British Royal Navy. See, Britain also wanted an independent Latin America, mainly for trade reasons. So their interests just happened to line up perfectly with America's. The British Navy acted as a kind of unofficial, unspoken enforcer of the doctrine. So, let's recap. We've gone from defending trade on the high seas to seizing territory on the continent to declaring an entire hemisphere off limits. It's pretty clear that these early actions really did lay the foundation for America's rise as a global power. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. When you look at all of this, the assertive, sometimes aggressive, and often controversial actions of this early period, what echoes of this foundational, this is our backyard mentality can you still see in America's role in the world today? It's definitely something to chew on.